Hi, my name is Jim Leftwich, and I'm going to be talking to you a bit about something I'm passionate about, something I know a little bit about, and that happens to be blues music. We're going to concentrate on post-war blues. I'll explain what that means in a second. But what is the blues? Well, the blues can be defined a number of ways. Some of my favorite quotes are, "The blues is a good man feeling bad." People say if you don't like the blues, you have a hole in your soul. We'll talk a little bit about rock and roll at the end of this. And Muddy Waters had a famous line, "Blues had a baby, and they named it rock and roll." If you're a musicologist, you might say the blues is a pentatonic scale with a call and response, 1-4-5 chord structure. Anyways, the blues is a lot of things, but to me, it's a music that I'm very, very passionate about. Something that I actually discovered in college. My roommate uh, in my dorm, a guy who lived across the hall from me, had a huge record collection. Yes, records, I'm that old. Vinyl records, and I put on a Muddy Waters record, and I was hooked right from there. So I wish I could show you some videos along the way. That was my initial plan, but that didn't come to be. So all I really have are stills, photos, which I'll use for inspiration and talk over those slides, and whatever I'm inspired to share with you, I will. But perhaps I should define post-war. Why post-war? It's basically an arbitrary distinction. It has nothing to do with the war when we're talking about World War II. Just generally the blues before that time, before World War II, before the mid-40s, was pretty much an acoustic rural music. Wasn't electrified. Mostly acoustic guitar, some harmonica, some piano. First started recording in the 1920s. The first blues recording was 1920, Mamie Smith's Crazy Blues. Funny, actually, the first big stars of the blues were actually women throughout the 20s, Bessie Smith and Ma Rainey, people like that. Some of the great blues players and singers from that, most of it started actually in the Mississippi Delta. So we'll talk about that, how the blues migrated from Mississippi. That's part of the story of post-war. You had a lot of veterans coming back. You had factories opening up north, and it was a better life for a lot of the poor blacks in the South. So Mississippi has probably the richest vein of blues history. Texas, a lot of blues came from Texas. You had blues coming from the Carolinas. And so post-war blues is pretty much, we're going to be talking about electrified blues. So that's kind of the distinction I made. And keep in mind, I'm not showing you videos, but you're welcome on your own time on YouTube. Plug in the names of any of these bluesmen I'm talking about, and you'll see live footage. And let's get started. I'll show you some slides. Okay, this one, that's Blind Lemon Jefferson. Okay, he was a Texas blues man, great acoustic blues band. You can see he's got his acoustic guitar there, and he was blind. You'll actually find there are a lot of old bluesmen that were blind. Blind Lemon, Blind Blake, Blind Boy Fuller, Blind Joe Reynolds. A lot of them were blind. Blind Willie Johnson's one of my favorites. Anyway, this photo was taken in 1928. I think it's the only surviving photo of Blind Lemon Jefferson. It's kind of a funny story that Lightnin' Hopkins, who is a great blues man, got his start driving for Blind Lemon. Obviously, Blind Lemon couldn't drive, so from gig to gig. But Blind Lemon had kind of a sad story. He died in a Chicago winter. He slept on a wet mattress and caught pneumonia and died. But that's the image of what the blues was before it was plugged in. It was an acoustic music, and it wasn't a sad music. People think, oh, the blues is a sad music. No, it was a party music. They would get together on Saturday night, fish fries and juke joints and dance and listen to the blues. So it started acoustic, and then things got plugged in. This is actually no one a real note, Robert Lowry. I just wanted to show it to you guys so you can see kind of what it looks like. He's actually playing a National steel guitar there, which will probably be out of the price range for most of the early bluesmen. I know Bucka White actually did play a National steel, but they sound particularly good with slide or bottleneck guitar. And if you can see on his pinky there, he has a little tube over his pinky. That's called a slide or a bottleneck. Back in the old days, the bluesmen would actually take a wine bottle, crack it open, hold the bottleneck over a fire to smooth it out, and use that to put on their finger. And it creates a great sound. Instead of fretting the guitar, pushing down on the strings, you're sliding on top of the strings. So it's kind of a microtonal thing where you can get in between the notes. So it's a really cool sound. Always wanted to own one. They're really, really cool guitars. The vintage ones are quite expensive, several $1,000s. But that's kind of what the image of the solo rural bluesman guitar, slide guitar, just his voice. So Okay, this is actually Taj Mahal. Taj is a he's a second generation. His first records were in the late '60s. He was a musicologist actually. He really knows his stuff. He really knows the blues. Tours, I've seen him many times, but he's a purveyor of the old blues. He's someone that's keeping it alive. Very creative guy. Really good at what he does. So now we're going to get into the electrified blues. This is a great photo. This is actually, and I want to talk mostly about John Lee Hooker, who's there at the bottom left. In the middle there is B.B. King. I'm sure you guys have heard the news lately. What's going on with B.B. Very sad. We'll get to B.B. A bit later. But and then the violin player, I'm not too familiar with. I think his name is Papa John Creech. But that's kind of an unusual arrangement to have him up there with a bunch of bluesmen. But so John Lee Hooker, there he is in the bottom left. John Lee made the migration. He's from Mississippi. He did a little bit differently. Instead of going to Chicago, he went to Detroit. Not sure exactly why he went there. I think it may have had something to do with the automotive industry. He thought he'd get a job up there. But he's playing a Gibson guitar there, beautiful red Gibson guitar. I actually own the same guitar that he plays, which oddly is not a very expensive guitar. It's kind of a knockoff of a more a Gibson guitar. It's an Epiphone. It's kind of geared kind of like a really high-end Gibson. So they call it the Sheraton 2, Epiphone Sheraton 2. Anyway, John Lee was pretty unique in his own right. People say he's the one who taught the world how to boogie. He was covered a lot by the British rock bands. His first single, 1948, Boogie Chillin', great tune. And it was just him. He never really, he very rarely played in a band format. He'd be tapping his foot, keeping time while he's playing. He played kind of a drone style. Instead of having chord changes, it was kind of hypnotic, the same sound over and over and over. But it had a groove, it made you want to get up and dance. John Lee lived until, I think he died in about year 2000. Got to see him several times. He headlined a lot of blues festivals I went to. Quintessential bluesman. He would dress up in nice fancy suits with a fedora hat with a feather in it. Short guy, maybe 5'5", 5'6". I can remember seeing him in concert. He would get up and he'd do a little dance. Here he is in his late 70s, early 80s, getting on the stage, doing his thing. So he kind of had a revival, a second life in, I guess it was the late 80s. He did kind of like a celebrity record. He had Bonnie Raitt. He had Robert Cray. He had a lot of prominent, Carlos Santana. He did a couple of those records throughout the 80s and 90s of inviting famous musicians, and they were good records. He did a duet with Bonnie Raitt of one of his old tunes called I'm in the Mood, which is a great version of it. It might have won a Grammy, actually. When you watch the Grammys, never paying attention to the blues category because it's absurd who they nominate. A couple years ago, Cyndi Lauper won a blues Grammy, so... Anyway, but there aren't too many authentic old bluesmen left. I mean, B.B. left us, 89 years old, and the first generation are all gone. The second generation musicians are almost all gone. So it's kind of a sad thing. I guess I was lucky to live in a time where I got to see a lot of them. So that's John Lee, and that's B.B. next to him. We'll get to B.B. A bit later. So why don't we keep moving here? That's Buddy Guy. Buddy is probably, with B.B. gone, he's carrying the torch. B.B., they called him King of the Blues. They won't call Buddy King of the Blues, but he's probably the best known. He's a Chicago guy. Kind of did these out of order. I wish I'd showed you Muddy Waters before Buddy Guy, because Muddy actually gave Buddy Guy his first gig. But Buddy's great. Buddy tours all the time. He had a really explosive style of guitar. Jimi Hendrix loved him. Jimi Hendrix just adored Buddy Guy. Buddy has a club in Chicago. I go to the Chicago Blues Festival every year. It's always the second weekend of June. Great big free blues festival. And Buddy Guy has a club called Buddy Guy's Legends. And great club, recently redesigned. Really down home, really great music, really great sound. But Buddy's explosive. I mean, he's an amazing. Sometimes his performances get to me though. He does a lot of talking. He'll he has this gimmick where I can play like Jimi Hendrix, and he plays, I can play like Eric Clapton. But anyway, Buddy is probably number one blues man around today. So with BB gone, Buddy carries the torch. Okay, slides are out of order here. All right, that's Albert King. Albert King was a great bluesman. Funny, three of the greatest blues guitarists were last named King. You've got B.B. King, Albert King, and Freddie King. A lot of blues aficionados kind of play around how to rank them 1 through 3. You'll probably get different answers from different people. Albert was very, very influential. He had his own style, as you can probably tell from the photo. He was a very large man. He was about 6'5", 300 pounds. He was left-handed, and he played his guitar technically upside down, which a lot of left-handed players learned to do. It was very hard to find left-handed guitars back in the day, I guess. And Jimi Hendrix did it. Another great bluesman, Otis Rush, did it. So he had a very unique style of guitar, really aggressive bending of the strings, not just a one-step bend that most people would. He would bend a whole step and a half or two, because he wasn't pushing the strings, he was pulling down on the strings because he had the guitar upside down. A very percussive style too. But he was a huge, huge influence on a lot of bluesmen and rock guys. He played a Gibson Flying V guitar, and got to see him once. I only got to see Albert King one time, and it was in the year 1990 in Houston, Texas. And visiting my grandparents there, and I slipped out and saw Albert King, and it was an outdoor show, and he was playing, and it was great. And all of a sudden the police come in, and they get up on stage, and they're talking to Albert, and everyone wonders what's going on. And so Albert gets on, he goes, "You know what? They're telling me I'm making too much noise. We have to move it inside. I'm too old for jail." So they moved the concert indoors. We finished the concert indoors. But Albert was a great blues man. Really kind of regret I only got to see him that one time. I believe he died a year or two later, I think 1992. The life of the blues man was tough. They didn't live, most of them didn't live extended lives. Some of them surprisingly did. Some of them, BB was 89 when he passed. There were two old bluesmen, David Honeyboy Edwards, who he lived to be about 95, and then Pine Top Perkins died 2 years ago. He was like 96. So but most blues musicians didn't have health insurance. There's actually foundations out there trying to help blues musicians. So that's Albert King. The other King I mentioned, there were three, is Freddie King. I don't have a picture of him, unfortunately. He was actually from Texas. They called him the Texas Cannonball, and he was more rock oriented, I would say, than BB or Albert. He had a more aggressive tone. He was a little louder. He died young. He was about 42 when he died. I think he died in the mid 70s. But depending on who you ask, a different blues or rock guy would rank the Kings differently. If you asked Stevie Ray Vaughan, he'd probably put Albert King number one. If you asked Eric Clapton, he'd probably put Freddie King number one. So so the three Kings. And I apologize, these slides being out of order is kind of disrupting my flow here. But okay, this was just a picture of, remember how I mentioned the blues was fun music, the blues is dance music, it was celebration. Well, here's a picture from a juke joint in Clarksdale, Mississippi. I've actually been there. They call it the Crossroads of the Blues, the famous Crossroads. The myth of the Crossroads is Highway 61 and Highway 49. Funny though, it doesn't really exist anymore. They've created a bypass that goes around the town. But there is like a cheesy little display of two guitars and a compass, and it says Crossroads of the Blues. And it's funny, all these historic spots in Mississippi now are marked. Historical associations have put up markers for all these famous things in the blues. I encourage you to go down there. And a buddy and I did this a few years back. We flew into Memphis, met up in Memphis, and rented a car. First stop was Clarksdale, Mississippi. We explored the Mississippi Delta. We found famous grave sites: Robert Johnson's grave, Sonny Boy Williamson's grave, Parchman Farm, the famous prison where a lot of these bluesmen spent a few times when they acted badly. Dockery Farms, where Charlie Patton learned the blues from Henry Sloan and became the first really big star of Mississippi blues. But as you can see from this photo, people are having a good time. That's what it's about. There's a great, the best club there is called Ground Zero. It's actually run by Morgan Freeman. and I've heard from time to time he'll poke his face in there. We didn't see him when we were there, but they really try hard to make it look like an authentic juke joint, with graffiti on the walls and the pool tables and the Southern fried food. And so anyway, and there are still a couple of these juke joints left. My buddy and I, we found one called Po Monkey's Club. It was basically out in the middle of a field. I don't know what they were growing there, but out in the middle of nowhere. I think it was Marigold, Mississippi, and looked like a juke joint. We couldn't go inside. It was closed at the time, but it had all kinds of painting on it and cool quotes and stuff like that. And so, yeah, but the indigenous Mississippi blues, it's not really around anymore. There are a couple old guys still left, so it's pretty much imitation now, which is kind of sad. But the blues did move north and went to Chicago, and hopefully we'll get to a Muddy Waters slide because that's logic. There we go. Okay, Muddy Waters. Okay, Muddy is pretty much credited with electrifying the blues. He was from Mississippi, right near Clarksdale. They've actually preserved the cabin that he grew up in on Stovall Plantation, and there's a Delta Blues Museum there in Clarksdale, and you can actually view the cabin, restored cabin that he grew up in. He was recorded actually before he came north in 1941. The Library of Congress came around trying to preserve local traditions and old blues musicians, and Muddy did get recorded in 1941. He had a famous tune he did there called "I Be's Troubled," which he retooled and electrified and renamed. So he had a couple recordings in 1941, and then he headed up to Chicago, straight up. If you look on a map, it's pretty much a straight shot, Mississippi, straight up the river, and a little bit east to Chicago. So he got there in the late 40s, and he pretty much established the quintessential band format, the blues band format, which became the rock band format. Really, he had guitar, bass, drums, singer, sometime harmonica player. But he played that style of guitar we talked about, slide guitar. Wasn't really that great an accomplished guitarist, but he had a wonderful voice. He had a stage presence. He really became the face of Chicago blues. I believe his first record was 1948 for Aristocrat Records, which 2 years later became Chess Records, which you may have heard of, the famous label. Certainly the biggest of the Chicago blues labels. It also had Chuck Berry on its roster, so a lot of hit records there. You can actually visit it's actually preserved, the old Chess recording studio, 2120 Michigan Avenue. You can actually visit it, and you can see where some of these recordings were made. So Muddy really was king of Chicago blues. His big rival, which I wish I had a slide to show you of, it would have been Howlin' Wolf. So it was always Muddy and the Wolf, and they kind of had a rivalry going on. Every once in a while, Muddy would try to steal someone from Howlin' the Wolf's band, or Howlin' Wolf would try to steal the guitarist out of Muddy Waters' band. They both had incredible musicians behind him. Probably the greatest harmonica player of all time, Little Walter, was in Muddy Waters' band, in his original band. He started doing his solo stuff in the early 50s and left. But yeah, I mean, Muddy went through a lot of players. Howlin's band stayed pretty much the same. He started with a guitarist, Willie Johnson, and then Hubert Sumlin came on board and really stayed with him until Wolf died in the mid-'70s. Actually got to meet Hubert Sumlin. He actually relocated to New York in his later years, and kind of an odd man. It was very awkward talking to him, but great guitar player, very unique style. So Chicago of the 40s and 50s was Muddy versus the Wolf. They were the kingpins. Muddy was idolized by the Rolling Stones, who came to Chicago to cut a record right there at Chess Studios. I believe it was called 2120 Michigan, named after it. And so they get there, and they look up, and who do they see? But it's Muddy Waters on top of a ladder painting the facade of Chess Studios. And so the Stones were aghast that this their hero, their musical hero, to make a little extra money, has to go up there and paint. So Muddy was the king, Muddy and Wolf. Also, in the mid-'50s, there was a British TV show, Shindig, and they wanted the Stones to come on, and they said, we'll do it, we'll go on, but you have to invite Howlin' Wolf too. So they brought Howlin' Wolf, they flew him over to England, and they put him on British TV. So Muddy had a number of hits. There's actually a fellow who wrote a lot of these songs. who's kind of not appreciated enough. They call him the Shakespeare of the blues. And his name was Willie Dixon. He was another really big guy. He was a boxer. He was another guy, 6'5", 300. He played bass, but he's really most well known for his songwriting. Got My Mojo Working, Manish Boy. A lot of the great Chicago blues standards were written by Willie Dixon. I got to see him live once or twice. They did a tribute concert for him at Madison Square Garden once upon a time. So so Muddy really laid the foundation. He guitar, bass, drums, that whole format. He was famous for saying, maybe I said this off the top, but blues had a baby and they named it rock and roll. So Muddy and Wolf, Chicago blues personified. Okay, now we'll get into BB. I thought this is a cool photo. You can see how young he is here. Gosh, if he was 89 when he passed, he must be 20 here. He's a youngster here, and he's got his name written on his guitar. And WDIA was a radio station where he first burst on doing an ad, a jingle, Pepticon. I think it was something to settle your stomach. He had a little tune, Pepticon show is good, Pepticon show is good. Anyway, so that's how he got his start, and then people kind of caught on. They could play the guitar pretty well, and they started calling him Blues Boy, which became shortened to BB. His actual name was Riley B. King, and he had come up from the Mississippi Delta. Apparently, he did pretty good on the farm. He was a tractor driver. If you were a tractor driver, you were several notches above the fellows that had to pick the cotton. But he wanted a better life, so he left his town of Indianola and headed up to Memphis and Beale Street. And I'd like to say a word on Beale Street, actually. But that trip I mentioned before, my buddy and I, where we started in Memphis and then explored the Mississippi Delta, went to Beale Street, which used to be really blues central. I mean, really authentic blues. Lots and lots of the old bluesmen cut their teeth on Beale Street. And I was there 20 years before, and it was still pretty authentic. You had real blues clubs. It wasn't touristy. But then when my buddy and I were there, was this about 3 years ago, it had become a tourist trap, a place just for frat boys to drink, and really, really disappointing. It lost all its authenticity. So anyway, Beale Street was a big disappointment. But that's where BB really got started. So BB doesn't follow the traditional pattern of leaving the Delta and going up to Chicago. He went to Memphis and started doing quite well for himself. That's the next one, BB. There's BB a little bit later. This is in the 1970s probably, or 1980s. He's standing up, which he stopped doing later in life. He, the life of the road was tough, and he did a lot of gigs. He, for about 30 or 40 years, he averaged about 300 gigs a year. He spent his life on the road. He developed diabetes, so he played I'd say his last 10, 15 years sitting down. But there he is playing. He played the same guitar pretty much throughout his life, and he named his guitar Lucille. There's not one Lucille. Obviously, throughout the years, there have been a lot of Lucille's, but he always named one Lucille. They're always Gibson ES335s. I'll tell the story he famously used to tell in his past, all the time about how the guitar got its name. And apparently he was playing a gig in a place in Arkansas, and the barn where the gig was going on caught fire, and everyone ran out. And he realized his guitar was in there, so he ran into the fire to fetch his guitar and brought it out. And realized after he come out that was not a good idea, that really he could have died in there. And so he found out how the fire started, and apparently a fight broke out and a kerosene lamp was knocked over and started the fire, and the two men were fighting about a woman named Lucille. So he said, I'm going to name my guitar Lucille, so I'll always remember never to do something that stupid again. So that's where the whole Lucille story comes from. But yeah, BB was a great performer. He always had a huge band. There's a famous picture of him in front of his tour bus in the 1950s, and he's easily got 15 musicians, which is a sign he's very successful, because then it means he has to pay 15 musicians. So yeah, BB lived a life on the road. I saw him many, many times. I probably saw him a dozen times. In his later years, kind of the signs were that BB needed to kind of retire. He really had lost his edge, and the last time I saw him was at Jazz Fest a good 3 or 4 years ago, and in New Orleans. We had about a 15-minute "You Are My Sunshine" sing-along, and made me kind of sad. BB, I think it's time to hang it up. But anyway, sad he died. Sad, too, there seems to be some unpleasantness around his estate and everything. But so BB was BB was the undisputed king of the blues. No one would argue with you there. Okay, now guess we're getting at the 25-minute mark, so just want to show you some slides of people that the blues passed on to. Stevie Ray Vaughan, who sadly I never got to see live. That's something I'll carry to my grave. Anyway, he was a great Texas blues man. When we're talking about the Kings, Albert was probably his biggest influence, but he really had brought the blues to a new audience. Very, very sad, died in a helicopter accident in 1989. I remember the day quite well, as I had just gone back to college and was seeing a Johnny Winter concert, Johnny Winter and Bob Margolin, and he had died the day before, and they played nothing but Stevie Ray songs. And funny, I ran into Bob Margolin at a show once many, many years later, and I mentioned the show that I saw you in Charlottesville, Virginia. And he looked at me and said that was the day Stevie died. He remembered it vividly. So definitely check out Stevie Ray Vaughan, great, great guitar player. Still call him blues, but he does cross over a little bit into the rock world. But sad he passed at a young age, mid-30s, but great musician. There's Jimi Hendrix, who most people would tell you is probably the greatest electric guitarist ever, and certainly his music was blues-based. That was his first love. He did record some straight blues. His most famous blues tune is a tune called Red House, which is pretty much a meditation on Albert King. Sounds as if it's an Albert King song. But Jimmy was the greatest. Rolling Stone does their rankings of the top 100 electric guitarists of all time, and Jimmy's always number one. Jimmy was a showman. We mentioned Buddy Guy at the top. Buddy Guy inspired him to do a lot of the playing the guitar with his teeth and behind his neck and doing all kinds of crazy stunts and stuff. And another case of someone who left us too soon. I believe he was 27. Had a night of taking drugs and in his sleep vomited and choked on his vomit, I believe, and died at 27. A lot of these guys died the same age, 27. But Jimmy definitely carried the torch of the blues, and always thought that if he had lived, he would have done a few straight blues albums later in his career. Okay, this is the last slide I have for you guys. This is the Rolling Stones, who when they started out in the early 60s, they had no intention of being this big rock band or a pop band or sell a whole bunch of records. They just wanted to be the best blues band in England. And, they started very authentic. They played straight blues for quite a while. But if you listen throughout the years, they've never lost their roots in the blues. Keith Richards adores the blues. His hero is actually Chuck Berry. Chuck Berry would have been a good one to have a slide. Chuck Berry kind of took the blues shuffle rhythm and sped it up, and it became rock and roll. And Chuck was Keith's idol. If you ever, there's a documentary, Hail Hail Rock and Roll, about Chuck, and you can see what a jerk Chuck Berry was. But Keith Richards leads his band in that documentary. It's worth checking out. But Keith was a great guitar player. And the Stones were certainly rooted in the blues. There were other British blues bands, Led Zeppelin, who certainly took the blues as inspiration, the Animals. That's what really had to happen, is that America had kind of forgotten about the blues, and then the mid-'60s rolled along, and these British bands took the blues, and some of it they kept as straight blues, but they sped it up, and they gave it an edge, and it became rock and roll. And then people started noticing, and then they started looking for those old blues guys that were in the 20s and the 30s, and a lot of them got to have a second life in the 60s, traveling the world, playing their form of music. And certainly, Muddy Waters had kind of fallen out of favor in the late 60s, early 70s, and mid-70s rolled around. He got to have a second career. Johnny Winter went and produced a whole bunch of records and stuff. And so anyway, so the blues does still exist. The older guys are pretty much all gone, but there are a bunch of contemporary blues musicians you can check out. If you want to reach out to me and maybe get a few suggestions, I'm happy to help. It's my email is jbl@berkeleycollege.edu. So the blues will always be around. There is a little bit of sadness that the original blues is, dying a slow death, I guess. But you'll hear the blues in a lot of it. It really is an American art form. It really is something that's uniquely American. It came over the slave ships, inspired by African instruments and rhythms, but it's something really invented here in America. And so look into contemporary blues. Find they're great blues musicians touring all the time, playing. So I hope maybe by listening to this, I turned you on to the blues, and you might check it out. Anyway, so I had fun sharing this with you guys, and I'm going to stop the recording now. So JBL at berkeleycollege.edu if you need any suggestions. Hop on YouTube, plug in a couple of these guys, and Albert King, Freddie King, B.B. King, John Lee Hooker, and have some fun. All right.